Hello, Bluefire members. This is DDBeast. We got a concept video for you. This is a kind of brief little video on using Flopzilla, deciphering flop textures, kind of learning how that range hits your opponent, or just how your opponent's range does on various flop textures, and just when to c-bet, when not to c-bet, all that and much, much more in 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into it. First things first, something you should definitely have committed to memory is just kind of this really simple pot odds chart. It's basically saying, for example, if you c-bet half pot, which is kind of the norm or standard kind of in here, you're getting 2 to 1 on your money. There's full pot in the middle. You're laying half pot or risking half pot, so you're getting 2 to 1. And we know that whenever you're getting 2 to 1, you need to be good about a third of the time, or they need to fold at least a third of the time for your bet to be profitable. As with all things in poker, it's not 100% that cut and dry. This kind of assumes that you're just giving up after that bet, or just check folding the turn and the hand's over, which isn't necessarily the case. So you have to consider future streets. Whether you have kind of implied odds from barreling and taking on the pot later, or perhaps there's some reverse implied odds that you have to take in consideration also. We'll touch on that later, but for the most part, this is a pretty good guideline on how you can construct your c-betting range. And I think what we're going to learn is there's not a ton of flops where your opponent is continuing more than 67% of the time. And what we can take away from that is we're probably not c-betting nearly enough. That would be my wild accusation, because it's pretty tough to get a lot of flops like this. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into some kind of practice scenarios and tweak some ranges, see what happens. Let's just suppose in this scenario that we open in early position and we get flatted by middle position, who we think has a range of something like this. Say we're deepish and he's flatting with 9-8 suited, 10-8 suited, as well as all his pocket pairs, and some of those speculative hands, and of course he's likely 3-betting aces, kings, ace, king, maybe wider, probably wider, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt here. Even on a coordinated flop like this, with this Jack-10 coordination and a flush draw, c-betting half pot is still borderline, and could be profitable. It could come down to if we had like ace-3 of clubs, we might c-bet, knowing that we can barrel all these club turns, and potentially 4 or 5 turns could be good to barrel as well. So we have a bit of barreling equity there that might kind of sway that into a c-bet rather than just checking and folding. Because I expect when we do check that it's going to be pretty tough to realize any equity that we have. Aside from barreling equity, we do have 3 outs to an ace, which very well may be good. So we have some other equity in the hand. If it's kind of this borderline scenario where it's pretty close, I'm more likely to bet something like this rather than if we had if we just opened with 6-5 of diamonds and we just have total air. I'm probably just giving up with a hand like that. So what I like to do in these little practice scenarios is just kind of tweak the flop one card at a time, just so I can really get a good grasp of what's happening with his range, and how big the changes are when we mess with the flop texture. So I might just move from Jack-10 deuce to Jack-9 deuce. Again, we were starting off at 68%, and that's the percentage that he's continuing with. What I've done here is just made filters to create a range that he continues with. That includes top pair sets, 2 pairs, etc. Middle pair, I think pretty much everyone's continuing with. I omitted weak pair, or these pocket pairs that have 2 overs. We're folding those out. And then of course we have flush draws, open enders. I've even included all gutters. Again, just to kind of show you that, even if somebody's calling with all their gut shots, they're still not connecting that much of the time. So even with all those gutters in play, which is, I wouldn't say 100% standard, for the most part, these flop continuing ranges are pretty low. So just tweaking from Jack 10 deuce to a slightly more disconnected Jack 9 deuce makes it a pretty clear bet in that situation. It just takes away just enough of that connectivity to fold out those few extra hands. And you'll kind of see that when you do play with the textures this way, there will be kind of that breaking point where we'll get away from kind of the meat of his range, and then there will just be kind of a split where, okay, suddenly he's whiffing a lot of flops from that point on. And as we move further down, it's dropping pretty rapidly as we lose stuff like, all those gutters like King Queen and King 10, Ace Queen, stuff like that. We're losing all those hands, which is a pretty big factor. So we see that percentage drop pretty quick. And then once we do lose all those hands, we kind of lose as much as we can in that area. It's going to stay a little stagnant, and might even turn up at some point. So it kind of bottomed out here at that 51%, and then it's kind of going up from that point, trending upward, and that's because we're now allowing these pocket pairs to call, like pocket fives now have a set, sixes call, sevens call, etc. So we're just letting in a few more hands at that point. So it's really good to kind of decipher this. I mean, we're just changing one card on the flop, and it's a world of difference. Another important thing I want to point out is the importance of the offsuit hands. In this particular example, most of his range is comprised of a lot of these suited hands, but these offsuit hands have, 3 times as much combos. We're looking at 12 combos of offsuit hands versus 4 combos of suited hands. To clarify, what I mean is there's 12 combos of ace queen off, whereas there's only 4 combos of ace queen suited. So essentially what that's going to mean is his offsuit hands are going to have a lot more weight than his suited counterparts. Granted, obviously they're not going to make as many flush draws, but they're going to hit way more pairs, way more top pairs, middle pairs, or if you have them included for gutters, open-enders, that's going to be a bigger part of the range. So it's important to have a good grasp of his offsuit holdings, just because, just adding in like a couple is going to have a pretty big effect. For example, if we throw in King Jack, Queen Jack, his top pair percentage jumps from 29% to over 40%, which is pretty significant. If we were to do the same here, like right now he has 29% top pair, and if we take those out, it's only 26%, just because, again, with the jack on the board, there's only 3 combos of these King Jack hands. I guess King Queen's not a factor. I meant to do this. So basically, it's not going to be nearly as drastic of a difference with King Jack suited, Queen Jack suited versus King Jack off, Queen Jack off, just because of the sheer number of combos that are going to be in the range. So that's an important thing to take into consideration. So definitely one good way is to just slowly work at different flops. Just tweak kind of one card at a time. Here we kind of started off with something coordinated, but we could also do say we want to work on just totally dry flops, and we'll just see, okay, how does ace 8 deuce compare to king 8 deuce, or for that matter queen 8 deuce, and just work on super dry stuff, and you'll start to get a feel, and you'll start to pick out okay, he has a lot of ace x in his range, he's actually going to hit this flop somewhat often. I mean, I'm speaking hypothetically, that's not the case in this situation, as he's whiffing it a lot of the time. But if he's somebody that has like all suited aces in his range, he'll hit that flop well. I guess we kind of touched on, when we can make tweaks to, and if we're at that like borderline decision where it's really close between a c-bet or not a c-bet, and we're saying, okay, if we have barreling equity or if we have overcard equity, we could be a little more barrel heavy in those situations or c-bet heavy in those situations. Another situation where we might want to tweak it the opposite direction, maybe we want to err on the side of checking, is, as we talked about, obviously, if we just have no equity or just, no hope for the hand pretty much, we might just give up in that spot. But we might also have reverse implied odds. Say we're facing somebody that's starting with a pretty tight range. Maybe he's slow playing some aces and kings pre and kind of his bigger hands, and maybe he's slow playing on the flop pretty often. Like here, it's pretty close between c-betting or not. But I would probably give up against somebody that's going to have that strong of a range for the most part, and if they're prone to slow play, just because if we do, then spike a hand on the turn that is seemingly an improvement, his range could be just so incredibly strong that we're still just getting totally smashed. So there's a bit of reverse implied odds going on there. So we focus on kind of like slowly tweaking flop textures. The other parameter we can mess with is our opponent's calling range. So we started off with kind of a middle position flatting range, something like this. What about a big blind flatting range? And let's go back to the first flop we started off with, the Jack 10 deuce. And if we take something that has a lot more holdings, calling a lot wider, we'll kind of see how that changes from something that's tighter. This scenario, I think on that particular flop, they're pretty similar. So it goes from 68% to 71%. And that's because, yes, he has a lot more holdings in his range, but the meat of that range, again, is going to be connecting with that Jack 10, because it's like right in there. Whereas if we were to do something like 6-5 deuce, something that's just not going to connect very well with his range, just because he's going to have a lot of, all his broadways whiff, all this ace-x, well, most of the ace-x whiffs, all those overcards whiff, so he's actually only connecting with 36.6%, which is very, very minute. Now, if we're going to take this flop and compare it to that tighter middle position flatting range, we see that he's connecting 50% of the time, just because he doesn't have all that garbage that's whiffing. He doesn't have that many broadways that are whiffing. He's going to have a lot of overpairs in his range and a lot of really strong flush draws. So in that scenario, I would be much, much more likely to c-bet against this big blind range. Just generally speaking, it's important to pick out, there's coordinated flops, but not all coordinated flops are the same. Like 6-5-4 is vastly different from, Jack 10-9, where he's connecting like 80% of the time. So not all connectivity is the same, and it's important to kind of find where that gap is, because at some point, when we get to like 8-7-6, it's going to kind of drop off. So still super high continuing range. 9-8-7, still very high continuing range. Now it's starting to drop off when we get to 8-7-6, and it pretty much just continues to drop off. Now he's under half the time. So it's important to find that kind of breakthrough where we've like broken through his range, and now he's just going to be whiffing a lot of the time. And that's when we can really c-bet confidently and profitably. So I have pushed that to the time limit, so I hope this has been helpful, and let me know if you have any questions. And this is DDBeast signing out. Cheers.